humble photograph is without a doubt one of the most important inventions of modern times. The camera obscura, the brainchild of Frenchman Joseph Niepce, captured the world's first permanent photographic image in 1822. Before this time, we had to rely on artist impressions of etchings, sketches and paintings to record historic events and people. These images, many of which are still with us today, are merely only interpretations of the subject matter. For whatever reason, whether it be the person in a portrait or the artists themselves, they could easily distort the image being created to show the subject in a more flattering light. That now became an inaccurate record of how the future sees the past. The camera, however, captures the exact image. The camera never lies, as it were. During the Victorian era, the camera developed and became affordable for the middle classes to afford. In the late 1800s, it was common for a man with a creative eye and a little wealth to purchase equipment needed to travel around the country snapping the newly built towns and villages that had cropped up from the expansion of the Industrial Revolution. These images of the new shops, schools, streets and transport, along with the local population, were printed on postcards and sold back to their local people, who revelled in the new technology that was taking place. A gold mine of a business, and an unwitting time capsule for all of us to look back on in the future time. Golborne itself has had its fair share of photographers over the years. Many of the postcards and other historical images can be seen in the first book, Golborne in Old Photographs. In this DVD, we take a journey again to the past of Golborne, but this time we compare side by side the Golborne of yesteryear and the Golborne of today. With local information and social history, we tell the tale of Golborne then and now. The centre of Golborne, the New Inn on High Street. This is a very old photograph, and we're not sure when it was taken. The parish marriage records state that Mary Ellen Ashcroft, 37, of the New Inn, married William Lightfoot on the 9th of October 1912 at St Thomas Church, Golborne. The bride's father was Peter Ashcroft, innkeeper of the New Inn. The name on the sign on the side of the building reads P. Ashcroft. This will date our photograph to some time around or before 1912. We have no clues to who the gentlemen are stood in front of the drinking establishment, but they are dressed in clothing of the period to which our estimated time frame suggests. This building was built well before the Victorians constructed what we can see today at the heart of our village. We can see that some of the windows have been bricked up. This is due to the windows tax set by King William III in 1696. It was a tax imposed relative to the prosperity of the taxpayer, due to the poor population clipping their coins and taking pieces of them to keep for themselves. Formed under the act of making good the deficiency of the clipped money, it was a way of the government spitefully getting their own back on its subjects by taxing the amount of windows an establishment had. People responded by bricking up some of their windows so that they would only have to pay the minimum amount of money. This is where the phrase daylight robbery comes from. The Act was repealed on the 24th of July 1851. Peter Kane, 1918 to 1991, was one of England's greatest flyweight boxers and a world champion in the 1930s. He was born in Haywood in Lancashire, and his family moved to Golborne before his first birthday. Peter was a blacksmith at Naylor's Foundry for a time and used to train upstairs in a room of the New Inn. In the 1940s, he moved up to bantamweight and still continued to win his fights. Out of his 88 wins, 53 were knockouts. He was famous for his powerful punching power. In the late 1970s, the allegedly haunted New Inn was demolished. In 2000, the now completed Peter Kane Square was built to mark the new millennium by commemorating one of our most famous sporting heroes. Here we see a gathering around the big lamp during walking day at around the turn of the century. No one can be sure when the walking days first started, but they were only a northwestern religious tradition. The grandeur of such an event, surrounded by a recently built Victorian Golborne, prompted one and all to don their Sunday best and join in with the festivities. Exciting times indeed. Today, however, some of the buildings have been destroyed by strong winds during the mid-2000s, and the walking days and carnivals have ceased due to a combination of lack of interest and the increasing council costs of organising and planning such an event. Taken in 1931, we have in the foreground the Baptist Church walking day. In the background, you can see some of the rural farming areas that used to be in abundance in Golborne. Just under the left corner of the banner is Golborne St Thomas Church in the distance. In the early 1950s, as a response to the need for housing due to the mining industry's growth, Sycamore Avenue and the surrounding streets were built. Known as the pit houses, the miners and their families lived in this accommodation whilst they were in employment in the colliery. The colliery has long since gone, and the pit houses still stand there, living proof that building new homes on demand may not be a bad thing after all. The gateway to Golborne, Golborne Dale Road. The boundary of Golborne and Newton is dead centre of the bridge that runs over Millingford Brook. This is Joe Duffy and Frida Ellis. It was taken on Tanner's Lane, just near the entrance to Queen Street. What is interesting about this photograph is when it was taken, the subjects had no idea that the environment in which they are located would change so much in the future. You can see the entrance to Queen Street here, and just after it, a terraced house stood in the vicinity of today's library. In the distance, just behind the bridge, is the electric substation that was referred to as Electric Works. Today, it is long gone, along with the signal box, which is visible to the right on the bridge. In the colour photograph, there seems to be a wider field of vision compared to the black and white image. This is a phenomenon related to focal length of old-fashioned analogue photographic lenses versus modern digital process of capturing images. Park Road. Some of the most lavish and grand homes are in this area. The first owner of the colliery, Robert Worsley Esquire, was said to have moved here from Haywood Hall. This manor house was approximately where today's Church Street is. It is said that his wife disliked the massive manor that she and her husband were living in, and told him that she wanted to move. He didn't want to move, as the house represented his status and wealth, and he wouldn't budge on the matter. So, his wife said that the grounds of their home were sinking due to mining subsidence caused by his pit. Of course she lied, and eventually he agreed to downsize and move to Park Road. The building was demolished, even though it was of sound structure. Today, Park Road still has those grand houses, one of which, at the time of recording, belongs to Labour MP Andy Burnham. It also boasts affordable terraced housing too. The opening of the first Labour Club in 1908 by Mr. J. A. Seddon MP. In the picture, Mr. and Mrs. Seddon and family Walter Lowe, Mr. R. Pasquill, Mr. J. Howard, Mr. Thomason and Mr. J. Hewitt. Next to the club, which was on High Street, stood a quaint row of cottages. In the 1930s and 1940s, the steward, Mr. Dewhurst, and his wife lived next door to the Labour Club in one of the cottages. He was the steward there for 28 years. The club in fact was a tin hut and was the only kind of building in existence at the time to use this material for the purpose of a members' club. The cottages were demolished and the Royal Garage petrol station, as it was known, was built on the land. The petrol station was demolished in the 1990s to make way for the modern housing estate Stirrupfield. High Street of the 1980s. On the left, to the front of the picture, is Golborne Cycles. In years previous to this, it was fondly remembered as a pram shop called Sexton's. Also on the left, deeper into the photograph, is the old location of the office of Davron Taxis. Next to this was a chip shop that a lot of people remember from various eras with great affection. It was hailed as one of the best chippies in Golborne and once known as Croft's Chippy. The Crofts sold the business to Alan Wilcock and they then opened a toffee shop just over the bridge at Dover Lock in Abram. In the 1960s, Kath Kendall was the owner. In the 1980s, it was called the High Fry. It was always referred to as the Vic Chippy, as the public house called the Victoria, or Vic to give it its abbreviated term, was next door. It has been said over the years that the chippy was haunted by an old woman who sat in the corner of an upstairs room. Many of the staff that had worked there in the past can tell tales of strange feelings surrounding them whilst at work. So-called proof of the haunting was apparent when the chippy caught fire and severely damaged the upstairs of the building and left the haunted room unscathed. I think, haunted or not, it is up to you to decide. On the right of the picture is what was known as the Royal Garage, as it was owned by Harold Royal. Nowadays, we have more shopping facilities popping up at an alarming rate, not just the big ones that we have been used to for years, but smaller European ones too. There now seems to be a lack of local shops and services in our village, as the large corporations continually fight each other for the supremacy over each other, and as a result, they have forced the local businesses to disappear into thin air. William Tatton Company Limited started life in Leek, Staffordshire in 1869 and came to Golborne's Parkside Mill in the late 1950s. Producer of the revolutionary new man-made fibre crimpline, Tattons employed the experienced labour force of the previous business Courtaulds. Courtaulds had bought Harbins, the previous resident at Parkside Mill, with the view of closing it down and transferring the business elsewhere. As the market for crimpline was booming and Tattons was expanding, the move to buy the textile business from Courtaulds was a no-brainer. Parkside Mill won honour after honour in the textile industry and shattered seemingly impossible production targets, only to shatter them again. It was a grim time in 1959 for the employees of Courtaulds due to the closure of the mill, regarding their employer's ruthless business regime. The employees were so grateful to William Tatton's company for coming to the rescue and saving all their jobs that in 1967 the entire workforce volunteered to work on Christmas Day and Boxing Day to fulfil a very important export order. Now that's dedication. This is an empty and derelict Parkside Mill on Bridge Street. Formerly Harbins, this mill was closed down by the then current owners of the mill, Intex. It was demolished and several years later was regenerated as the Millingford Industrial Estate. This is the parish church of Golborne St Thomas. It was consecrated on the 31st of October 1849. Up until then, Golborners had to travel to St Oswald's in Winwick to worship. I bet they were glad when they built this church. During its lifetime, the church has seen many changes. You can see in the now photograph how they have made room for a garden of remembrance. A bit of a conundrum is this. After tons of research trying to discover the event that was happening in this photograph, there still remains an air of mystery as to what's going on. Some say it was an eventful big fire. Others say it was just a carnival. However, the photographer unwittingly managed to capture the shop in the background at the time, which was Pete's, now an Indian takeaway. A sign of modern Golborne indeed. This is possibly the only surviving photograph of the school in School Street. The school was called the Mill School, as it was built by the owners of Parkside Mill to school the children who worked there. The children went to school half of the time and spent the other half at work in the mill. They were referred to as half-timers. However, the government rethought this system of the half-time education and introduced compulsory full-time education for children in 1920. Later on, the school was affectionately known as the Cocky School. The name derives from the last headmaster who was in charge there, Mr. Smith. For some unknown reason, he was nicknamed Cocky Smith by the children, and the name stuck. After Golborne County Primary was built, the children from the Cocky School relocated there sometime in the 1920s. The building then became the mill's recreational facility, so all the functions took place there. It boasted an amazing interior and a dazzling dance floor. When the need for the Harbins and Tattons recreational club ceased, the building became derelict and was demolished. Surprisingly, no new houses were built on the site. This is Bridge Street, looking towards Golborne Centre. The mill you can see in the background is Parkside Mill. To the right of this photo, and out of shot, would be Holmes Lodge. Look how quiet this street looks compared to today. Just one car disappearing into the distance. As any town or village in the country, the motor car has definitely become more abundant as time has gone on. The building in this picture with the mock Tudor design is the location where the Royal Oak Public House once stood. When the drinking establishment closed its doors, it was converted into a cinema called the Pavilion. The filmmaker's grandfather, Bob Hughes, was the projectionist there for a while and lived there with his family in the 1950s up until the early 1960s. Previous to this, the Pavilion was affectionately known as the Bug Opera and later shortened to just the Bug. This was due to the fleas that were apparently resident there. Many residents of John Street could hear the films being shown when the venue's back doors were open on hot summer days. In the 1950s, the price for the Saturday matinee was, in old money, 3p. This works out to 1p in today's money. The next incarnation saw the Pavilion transformed into a bingo hall, which lasted from 1964 until the 1990s, when the building was demolished to meet the rising demand for new housing. The shop next door and to the left was a sweet shop. There were very common occurrences next to cinemas, as you can quite imagine. A very profitable business indeed. In the 1950s and 60s, the shop was called Marnie's and was owned by two sisters who lived across the road in Queen Street. One of the sisters was a teacher at Worsley Street School in the 1930s and 40s. The building suffered the same fate as next door and was demolished at the same time as the then bingo hall. At the far end of the row, you can see a one-storey building. Nowadays, this is the charity shop for Wigan and Lee Hospice on High Street. As with all of Golborne's buildings, many businesses have resided there. Most Golborners of a certain age remember it as Jessie Mort's electrical store. Syneth Sellers Pub. a very unique name for a public house. It was the only pub in the country with this name, and was home to many myths and legends of how the pub was known to many villagers as the Pub on Wheels. Many folk will tell you tales of how the building had wheels and could be moved up and down the street to avoid tax levies of the time. They will also tell you that this is true because their relatives once ran it at one time or another many years ago, and they said it was true, and they wouldn't lie, would they? Misinformation isn't lying. Now that we live in the modern world, science can answer a lot of questions for us. It tells us that a large brick building, which houses a cellar, needs a foundation and cannot be built on wheels and moved. So with this in mind, you can appreciate that there is a physical impossibility of the above story being true, right? The real story, however, came in the form of a bright young man with entrepreneurial skills and a good head for business. The unknown man found that when the navvies were constructing the railway lines in Golborne, they needed food and drink to give them the strength to do their job to the best of their ability. He started with hardly any money to sell the construction workers pies and butties to eat on their lunch break. Over time, as his profits rose, he had a wider selection of things to sell them. He could now afford a cart which, as it was on wheels, could follow the navvies along as they drove forward the railway tracks that one day would be used for the coal industry. He hit upon the idea of selling them beer after they had finished their shifts. He sold the beer from a barrel he housed on his cart and sold so much of it to the thirsty workers that he could now fund a building as a designated public house. Syneth Cellar was born of pure determination and good sound business acumen. So there you go, the actual true tale of how a man with a food and drink cart became a pub on wheels. Taken in the 1930s, this is the just built, brand new location of Haywood Avenue. The avenue was named after Haywood Hall, or house, which resided on the grounds of where the newly built estate now sits. The grounds boasted a large lake where people could fish from. Behind Haywood Avenue there are playing fields. It was here that Silcox Fair used to temporarily build their fun fair for a few days for the carnival in May. This was a tradition that lasted for years, up until the 1990s. This is a walking day parade on Bank Street, taken around 1961. Out of shot and to the right of the picture would be the Royal Public House. To the left is an old-style bus stop. Next to that is what people of the area refer to as the Croft. Here the children of Bank Street through the ages would play games and keep themselves occupied and out of trouble. In its place today stands a small row of 4 1970s townhouses. Golborne Centre. You can see in the back of the picture the old-style concrete bus shelter. Centre Save is behind the bus stop. Some people remember this shop being referred to as Cheap Johnny's due to it being called Johnny's Bargains. Norman Broomhead's newsagents is on the left and Wilcox Chemist is to the right. The chemist was later a Charis before the Co-op chemist moved in. Jeff and Hilda Hurd had the newsagents next to Wilcox in the late 70s and 80s, before Roberts knocked through to the next door to make a bigger shop. Here we have Naylor's Foundry Yard. They made a lot of different products to supply a lot of different industries over the years. One of their biggest contracts was for the coal industry. They supplied the conveyor belt systems that were used to transport the mined coal from below the ground up to the surface. The famous Golborne boxer Peter Kane worked there for a spell. Maybe his employment there helped with his training and helped him become the legend that he was. Today on the grounds is a pallet manufacturer, Unit Pallets. The modern photograph has been taken much closer to the house in the background, as over the years the yard has changed and access to the original location of the photograph was impossible. This photograph was taken outside number 49 Edge Green Lane on Good Friday 1936. Looking towards where the sub post office used to be, towards Strawberry Bridge, Mather's Jam advertised their products on the bridge at Edge Green Lane. That's how it's got its name. As you can see, the telephone box still resides in the same location today. Again, taken outside number 49 Edge Green Lane on Good Friday, but this time in 1937. Looking in the opposite direction towards Bank Street, you can see on the right hand side of the photograph the gap between the houses where Asda is today. This was a field which belonged to Fred Whitlow. These kinds of shops were typical of small industrial villages in the north of England in the early part of the 20th century. As you can quite easily see, the building remains exactly as it was all those years ago. It's just the changing face of human wants and needs as the world progresses forward that sees the businesses inside the shell of the building come and go like the tides of the ocean. The Lee Friendly Cooperative Society's branch at Heath Street. This branch was opened in 1861. This was one of 4 co-ops of Golborne. The others were in Lee Street, Church Street and Ashton Road. There were 2 kinds of cooperative at the time, this one and the CWS, which is featured later in the film. This is Ambrose Tootle and today his son Alan. The then photograph was taken in the severe winter of 1966. The shop window was frozen from the inside for 2 months. Ambrose used to burn candles on the windowsill to try and thaw the frost from the window so the displays could be seen clearly from the outside. Despite the biting temperatures, Alan still made the deliveries for his dad to the customers on his carry bike. On his rounds, he delivered to Winwick Church, Lanehead, Stubshire Cross, Loughton and all over Golborne. 56 drops in total on a Saturday morning. I think today's young would struggle with the concept of going out on their bikes in the deep winter. In 2011, Alan Tootle received an award for his services as he had never had time off from the business in 50 years. Affectionately known as Auntie Nellie's, in the 1960s this shop was owned by Nellie Sharp. Her birthday was on Halloween and she was a much loved and respected character in the community. However, the picture precedes the time frame. As you can see, it was an off-licence previous to Auntie Nellie's and sold Hall's ales, stouts and wines as well as various tobacco products. The door at the centre of the shop would be for the general store entrance and the arched doorway to the left would be the outdoor sales. Today though, the building is hidden away behind shutters, out of action awaiting its next incarnation, whatever that might be. This photograph was taken sometime in the late 1890s. It shows John Turton's grocer's shop, which was at number 1 Wigan Road. He had a shop in Turton Street before the Wigan Road shop. Upon closer inspection of the window, there is a logo for Cadbury's Cocoa, and just to the right is a poster advertising No Rinse Titan Soap. Also, on the front of the counter and top left of the lady stood in the doorway is a poster for Peak Freen. Today though, as with most shops countrywide, it was converted into a house as the decline of small shops fell into the spell of the supermarkets. Golborne South Station, on Church Street, showing a rather proud troupe of Morris dancers during a carnival. This station was demolished in 1959. The bridge that the girls are on was raised to make room for the electrification of the railway in the early 1970s. The room was needed to install electric cables that were at a larger height than the bridge was built at approximately 150 years earlier. This is why, in old photographs of this scene, the bridge looks quite a lot flatter than it does today. John Beswick's General Ironmongers. John owned the shop from the late 1890s to around 1913, when his son Lawrence Beswick took ownership. As well as being an ironmongers, they were a hardware dealers and a fishing tackle shop. They did a roaring trade by supplying such things as riddles for the keen allotment holder and specialist large shovels for shovelling the coal that was to be supplied to the booming coal industry. In the mid-2000s, strong winds blew down this building and the one adjacent to it, and they have been in this state up to the time of filming. This photograph, taken in the late 1920s, shows master boot and shoe repairer and clogger Norman Eckersley stood outside his wooden workshop on the corner of Heath Street and Silcock Street. In addition to shoe repairs, he handcrafted clogs. He carved out the wooden bottoms and fashioned the leather uppers himself. He then fastened them together with brass toe caps and studs to produce a beautiful finished item of fashionable footwear that would last the wearer a very long time. A skill that is largely lost today due to the nature of our disposable lifestyles. The internal sides of his workshop were surrounded by caged budgies and canaries with white mice also in cages, offering a warm welcome to the customers. The outside displayed two large posters advertising what was showing at the two cinemas that resided in Golborne, the Jubilee on Grimshaw Street and the Pavilion, nicknamed the Bug, on Tanner's Lane. Several years after Norman's death in 1949, his younger son Peter took over the premises, which he used for his upholstery and carpet fitting business. In the millennium year of 2000, the workshop was replaced with housing, a reoccurring theme of many of the photographs in this film. The lady standing in the doorway of Collier's newsagents and tobacco wholesalers is Mrs. Collier, the great-grandmother of John Ogden, the last proprietor of Collier's newsagents. Taken in 1901, the billboards outside the shop report the Guardian newspaper's headlines of the death of Queen Victoria and also news on the Boer War. Racing publications are also advertised. The shop has been in the Collier family up until it closed its doors to the public in the 1990s. Collier's supplied tobacco to the pitmen throughout its lifetime and was the last shop to sell chewing tobacco in the area. Pitmen from far and wide would buy their chewing tobacco to chew whilst working down the pit. It was said that it was used to prevent the coal dust from entering their lungs while they were busy mining the coal. A quiet Harvey Lane taken in 1963. You can see a dramatic change. Not in the physical realm, but with the numerous motor vehicles parked outside the owners' homes. When this picture was taken, it was the rich person's choice of transport. You could count on one hand the amount of car owners that you knew. Now, of course, it is not unusual for families to have 2, maybe even 3 cars statically lined up outside their home. The focal point of this picture is a tree that is not apparent in the 1963 photograph. You can see how it has been chopped down and regrowth has regenerated from the stump. The tree behind it doesn't seem to have altered much though. On the wall in both photographs you may notice a small square of iron that protrudes from the stone. This is what is left from the original railings that belonged to the house. All the railings in the country were cut out of the walls of every household that had them by the government during World War II. They would melt down the metal from the railings and use it for making ammunition and other such things to help further the war effort. If you take a walk around Golborne, you will notice little stumps of metal on walls of terraced houses all over the village. This is the opening ceremony of Golborne War Memorial, 1926. It was unveiled by Mrs. Harriet Cunningham from 10 Lee Street. Her 3 sons were killed in the First World War. John Dennis Cunningham was a private in the Expeditionary Force in the Mediterranean and was killed on the 9th of April 1916 in the Persian Gulf. George Garrity, also a private, was in the Prince of Wales Volunteers, South Lancs Regiment, 6th Battalion, and was killed in action on the 19th of April 1916. Lastly, Lance Corporal Edward Garrity served in France and was killed on the 30th of July 1916. A very devastating year for Mrs. Cunningham and her family. Virtually every town and village in the country has a war memorial. There are nearly 40,000 of them across Britain. And yet they stand unnoticed until the weeks leading up to the 11th of November every year. Amazingly, given the military and maritime history of Britain, there were very few war memorials before 1918. In Georgian and Victorian Britain, most soldiers joined the army to escape poverty and retribution from the law. So when they died, nobody considered commemorating them. That all changed after the First World War. The people who fought in the war were all volunteers, the regular working class fellow. The families of the fallen heroes demanded from their government a shrine to remember their families who hadn't returned from the war. They got it in the form of a cenotaph. Salisbury Street in the 1970s. As with most photographs of Golborne of the past, the colliery can be seen dominating the landscape like it was a living, breathing entity. Of course, it wasn't alive, but it was most certainly breathing. Black coal dust spewed from the chimney and clung to the brickwork of dwellings and workplaces like a black veil. The streets looked uncared for and tatty, a negative side of the coal industry that kept many Golborners in employment. Looking to the right-hand side of this photograph, next to the little boy is Joe Bennett, manager of Pete's Grocery Stores. The 2-year-old little boy is Joe's son, Norman Bennett. The family lived in Heath Street. Joe's wife, Elizabeth, had a cake shop there. There were many Bennett families who lived in Heath Street. They were all related and they were all business folk. There was a clogger, a shoemaker, a sweet shop, drapery and a wool shop. The Church Street branch of the Lee Friendly Cooperative. The bunting outside the shop suggests that the photograph was taken in 1952, the year of Queen Elizabeth's coronation. The motorcycle in the foreground is a rather spectacular 1949 BSA B31/33. When the co-op ceased trading, the shop remained empty for a considerable time until around 1970, when a local dealer bought it and opened its doors for a short time. The building now stands empty. 7 Queen Street, 1940/41. The lady is Elizabeth Walsh, née Anderton. With her are, left to right, Betty, Joan and Jimmy Walsh. Queen Street then was considerably different to the one we see today. It was often referred to as Pokey or Pucky Lane, meaning it was a very small lane. The street was an L shape, with a couple of houses to the left where Golborne Day Centre is now, and to the right a few more houses sprawling towards the railway line. The backyard that this photograph was taken in is approximately where the grounds of Golborne Library stands. The library was built in the early 1970s. In the background, you may notice a structure which is positioned over the railway line. This is a lifting mechanism referred to as a gantry, and it was used to remove steel that was delivered to Golborne from the steelworks of England. The steel, which arrived by train, was lifted off using the lifting tackle and put on the back of wagons to be delivered to Naylor's foundry for the manufacture of their products. In the days before motor vehicles, the process would be the same, but a horse and cart would provide the transport to the foundry. Today, at the time of filming, the street has a couple of businesses there and a large car park. There, a Thursday market used to boast a busy shopping day for Golborners up until its closure in the early 1990s. Supermarkets became the preferred method of shopping for the modern Golborner, a habit which is still in firm force today. This is Gawsworth Road Estate in the early throes of its development. You can see Whitlow's house in the central background, the rubber works to the right and Naylor's foundry to the left. At the back is Mandy Kelly and Anne Sumner. At the front, left to right, is Anne Wigman, Ruth Davis, James Sumner, Denise Vizard and Bill Stott. The photograph was taken approximately 1968. This photograph of Eden Vale was taken in around 1978. Golborne welcomed Eden Vale as its home in 1968. The factory was an important source of employment for the Golborner back then. It was owned by Grand Metropolitan, who also owned Burney Inn, Smirnoff Vodka and Bailey's, amongst other distillers and vintners. In 1990, the company was sold to Northern Foods, the well-known asset strippers, and in 1995 the factory was sold on to a spring manufacturer. Today, the firm Fast Flow are now the residents. Murphy's is to the left of the photo. They specialise in civil engineering and utilities. They moved to Golborne in the mid-1970s and still use the old train station as their base today. The bonk, where this photograph was taken from, is somewhat lower in elevation today. This was because of the Aberfan disaster which happened on Friday the 21st of October 1966. This was a catastrophic collapse of a colliery spoil tip that occurred in the Welsh village of Aberfan. 116 children lost their lives along with 28 adults. As a result of heavy rain, the spoil tip, their bonk as it were, liquefied and collapsed into the village, destroying a farm, terraced houses and a junior school. After the inquiry, the National Coal Board were forced to make spoil tips safer and smaller. 60 foot was taken from the top of the bonk. This is why this modern photograph has a different angle to that of the old picture. Also, during the time frame between the two photographs being taken, tall trees have grown, causing the photograph to be taken from the same position but at a lower elevation. Inside the bonk was hollow after the removal of the spoil. The spoil was sent to a factory in Widnes and was used to manufacture battery acid. In the 1990s, the Coalfield Challenge helped reclaim and landscape the bonk into something a little more easier on the eye. The date of this photograph is sadly unknown, but from the clues in it we can deduct that it is pre-World War I. A charabanc is parked outside the Manor Public House on Church Road. Charabancs were invented in France in the 1840s as horse-drawn sporting vehicles and became motorised before the First World War. They were mainly used for day trips for employees of the local industries and working men's clubs outings. They were not the most comfortable rides in the world, so long journeys were seemingly out of the question. Sometimes subsidised by the mill and factory owners in Lancashire and Yorkshire, the workers enjoyed day trips not too many miles away from home. The manor was home to the headquarters of the Anglers Society. Here the fishermen would meet to discuss their business over an ale or two. They would fish across the road at the lake belonging to Haywood Hall. Hence the pub was named the Manor after the hall over the road. Another demolition, this time in the 1990s to pave way for the accommodation for the ever-expanding population of Golborne. Taken in May 1908, this photograph shows a shop in Ashton Road that has been struck by lightning. The house next door was also affected by the strike. The children in this photograph are excited and curious over the damage caused by this natural phenomenon, as you can quite clearly see by the look on their faces. Today, however, the children would have to look on from afar, as the now stringent health and safety laws would not permit such close proximity to unsafe buildings. To the back right of the shop, you can observe the beginnings of the bonk being formed with the coal wagons on top. This shows just how quickly the spoil heap grew over a 60-year or so period. Again, in the name of progress, the building has been replaced with newer modern living accommodation. The location of the shop in the colour photograph is on the right-hand side of the street between the trees where the white van is. The colour photograph was taken from this perspective to show the viewer the familiar environment of today's Ashton Road in relation to the exact location in the original photograph. After countless hours of research and many people's opinions, it has been concluded that this is the alley at the side of what is today the Indian takeaway Farses. Compare the two photographs and draw your own conclusion. No information came along with this picture, but we can see the proud owner of a horse that won the first prize, possibly in a walking day or a carnival, at approximately the turn of the century. Not much has changed really, building-wise today here, but with the changing needs of modern life, the businesses are vastly different than they were. This is the Co-op shop on Ashton Road in the 1930s. The shop was close to the Angel pub, which has now been demolished and flats are now in the spot. The man on the right of this picture is Fred Whittaker, the manager of the store. Fred had a glass eye after tripping and falling on an old-fashioned tin opener at work. He tried to claim compensation through his insurance, but was refused a payment as the tin he was opening at the time of the accident was for a customer. The cooperative movement was born in Rochdale in 1844, when a group of 28 workers from a local weaving manufacturers united to form the Rochdale Equitable Pioneers Society. It was founded to provide honest and respectful shopkeeping practices to its customers. Many working class people were not getting fair treatment due to shopkeepers' ruthless trading practices, so the society was a welcome gift to the public. Common techniques used by the shopkeepers in the 1800s were shortchanging, misuse of weights and measures, and selling unfit for human consumption foodstuffs. The customer was given a financial stake in the business, which was now called the Cooperative Wholesale Society, CWS, to which profits were paid to them as the shareholder. This payment was issued twice a year and was referred to as a divvy. This new revolution in shopping changed the way for the better that shopkeepers ran their businesses forever. And, as ever, the building was demolished and new housing was built in the location. Finally, another image of the colliery, taken in the 1970s, captured from Gloucester Avenue. Apart from the obvious pit workings that are evident in the picture, the railway public house is on the left and Golborne St Thomas School on the right. The colliery was one of the most important industries of the village and was instrumental in creating the late Victorian revamp of Golborne. A new village was built from around the 1880s onwards, giving us the village centre that we see today, along with all the terraced houses that many of our ancestors lived in. This new expansion was needed to supply and support the fast-growing economy that the local coal industry had spawned. Before the coal mining boom, weaving and farming seemed to be the thing that our sleepy little village contributed to the economy. So it's no surprise, in its heyday, Golborne's inhabitants worked at the pit or in the mills. Just ask your parents, your grandparents, or your great-grandparents how much they remember about Golborne before the government sent all the manufacturing industries abroad and totally stole the heart and soul from our community. They'll tell you that Golborne, in its prime, was one hell of an amazing place to live and work.